Good evening. Today is August 10th, 2023. No special action, but this is the Land Development Code diagnostic report for the Planning Commission. It is 6:01. We can go ahead and begin the meeting. Thank you.
Good evening, Mr. Chair, members of the Planning Commission. I just want to introduce, you don't have to listen to me tonight, don't worry. I just want to introduce you all to our consultants that are working on the Land Development Code project. They're with Kinda-Keys Collaborative. And tonight with us, we have Marcia and Brian, and they're both here. We also have Brett Keast on the Zoom line, and so he's going to come in for part of it as well. And so I will turn it over to them. They're welcome to take your questions and present to you tonight.
Thank you very much, commissioners. Thank you for having us here. Brian Mabry with Kinda-Keys Collaborative. This will be a rather lengthy presentation, so buckle up. And we might even, at one point when Brett's through talking, we might suggest or ask if you want to take a 10-minute break or 5-minute or whatever, Mr. Chair, that you feel appropriate. But we'll just see at that point if you feel like it, or if you want to go on through, then we'll go on through with it. So this presentation is kind of important because it describes where we are heading with this project and what changes kind of at the big picture level that we would propose as we work on amending and updating your land development code. We no way to cover everything that we have been thinking about changing possibly, but these are sort of the mid to high level points as we go through. So the main part of this is going to be about the actual diagnosis and priorities for this critique. And then we'll have a little bit on the annotated outline toward the end of the presentation. The annotated outline being the proposed structure of the updated ordinance. This project has several goals to it. I'm showing them on the screen that we would like to see happen, and that the city, we believe, would like to see happen as well. Modernizing the document so that it is easy to use for lay people and professionals alike, those who make a living off of development, whether they're attorneys or designers or developers, what have you. Implementing the policies and goals and objectives of your comprehensive plan, which is very close to being adopted, as you probably know, is another big part of this project. Organizing it so that it makes logical sense, and there's sometimes a learning curve associated with that. When it's kind of shuffled around or seemingly shuffled around and gets, adopted. People wonder where the old provisions were. That's kind of part of what the annotated outline accomplishes. And if I can get back to okay. So organizing it so that definitions are all together, standards like setbacks and building heights and landscaping and parking are all sort of in the same location, and then procedures are all with themselves. So like standards and like provisions are together. Having a code that results in quality development, of course, everyone wants that in the city. That quality development being really development that is in line with your comprehensive plan in short terms. Streamlining so that there is more administrative approval as much as the council feels comfortable delegating out to staff is something that we always look for opportunities to provide in a code when we update one. Obviously council will be the final decision makers on what's in the code because they're the ones who will adopt it. And so we'll build in provisions that will give staff the ability to make decisions on certain things that maybe they currently don't have that ability to do. And then user friendliness, again, is always first and foremost in our minds. So Land Development Code provides several things and you already have one, so it's not like we're working from scratch to put together your zoning ordinance together with your subdivision regulations, together with a sign ordinance and a bunch of other documents. But in case others are listening in on this or streaming it or playing it back later, land development code puts together most of the things that you would need in order to do a development. So zoning and land use matters, which is zoning being what kinds of land uses can go on private property and how they impact their neighbors. The subdivision of land, so sort of street networks, how streets are laid out, where sidewalks and easements go and things of that nature. How a site is laid out as far as building location, building exterior design, buffering and landscaping, parking signs, and things of that nature. How nonconformities are treated, or grandfathering is another term that people often use. Establishing review bodies such as yourselves and the Board of Adjustment, and even staff positions like the Community Development Director and the City Engineer, and those types of positions getting kind of established and saying what they are responsible for. And all the different procedures, whether they are administrative procedures or procedures more related to development plan review or more related to conditional use permits or rezonings. Having all of those together in one location is important to us. How the document or how the regulations are enforced and what violations look like and what the penalties are will be part of this. And then, of course, definitions as well, defining certain terms of art, as they say, that are specific to planning and zoning regulation. So that's sort of what a land development code is and what it provides. Here's some things that it doesn't have to do with. And again, these are more probably useful for the lay public if they're viewing this presentation. It doesn't set a property tax rate or assess property values for any given property in the city. It also is not your capital improvements program. It doesn't set a schedule or a budget for expanding infrastructure or making water lines bigger or anything like that. It's not the building code, so it doesn't relate to how many bathrooms a place should have or the type of plumbing or electrical rules that apply. It does touch buildings in that it has to do with the exterior design of buildings and where they're placed on a property, but not what's going on in detail inside of them. And then it's not construction standards, which is more commonly handled in your engineering construction standards and specifications. It doesn't talk about road base or curb and gutter or manholes and things of that nature. So when we're done with this project, the document will sort of be laid out in a way that at the front, it's sort of front-loaded with what people want to know the most, usually what lay people want to know the most, which is once I know what my property is zoned, what can I do there, and how big of a building can I build, and what kind of setbacks do I need to follow, and if I have a fence, how big of a fence can I have, or those kind of things. Where can sheds go? Those kind of basic things we put closer to the front, and then the procedural matters and things that are more technical for people who, again, make a living off of using the land development code, then those are further back because they kind of know what they're doing already. But this document will be digital, native to the internet anyway. So it's not like it's ideally suited to have a big printed out hard copy, which someone can do if they want it, but it's going to, I'll have a slide about this later, but it'll be set up that there are hyperlinks within the document, like if it says see section 3.5 landscaping, if you click on the 3.5, it'll take you to that section that it's talking about, and there's definitions that get little definition bubbles that pop up if you hover over certain words. So it's like a true website as opposed to a static PDF. And it's sort of meant to be navigated online, but again, can be printed if someone wanted to do it that way. So you're wrapping up your comprehensive plan project, and some people might wonder what's the difference between what we're doing here and what's almost been completed with the comprehensive plan. You could think of the comprehensive plan as a menu at a restaurant, so it shows things that are available to order possibly, but it doesn't tell you how you make it or anything like that. It's not detailed. It's just the price and a picture sometimes of the food and descriptions. The land development code is like the recipe or the cookbook that shows how things get made. Think of the ingredients for a meal as kind of the standards, and then how long to cook and what you need to do as sort of the procedures that need to be followed in order to get approval. So it's very detail-oriented as opposed to the kind of policy recommendations that are in the comprehensive plan. So now to get more into the actual diagnosis, there's 7 topics that we will cover in this presentation, and those are just sort of the table of contents there on the screen. Aligning the land development code with the policies of the comprehensive plan is a very important part of this. We've provided staff with what's called sort of a plan implementation matrix, and that's just a little excerpt of it there on the screen, where we take some of the goals and objectives related to land use and development and put them in a table and then show ways that the land development code can implement those recommendations that are in the comprehensive plan. So that would be available if any of you wanted to see it. It's pretty dry, pretty technical, but it's a document that we've put together that just shows how the land development code can make the goals and objectives of the plan a reality. So I've pulled a few of these to show here. There's much more than these 3 or so that I'm showing, and they're also back on the boards back there. But there's a goal and an objective in the plan that relates to ensuring that industrial uses sort of are separated and buffered from basically residential uses and not become sort of an incompatible land use or a potential nuisance. So one thing that the Land Development Code can do to help make this goal and objective a reality is to strengthen the buffering standards. There are buffering standards already in your code, and that's great. Buffering being a landscaped area between, like, say, a factory or a warehouse over here and a residential area over here. So working on your buffering standards and making them even better is something that we would propose to do in this project. We can have things like varieties of buffer yards. You currently just have, from the way I read it, just kind of a standard kind of vanilla buffer yard, but we can have options that allow for flexibility for the developer of, like, an industrial development, for example, where there can be structural with a fence or a wall, or a natural without the fence or the wall. And there's sort of trade-offs for each one. The structural one has the fence or the wall in it, and so the actual width is narrower and there's fewer plantings in it because you got that fence or wall doing a lot of the work of the screening and buffering. A natural one doesn't have the expense or the maintenance necessarily of a fence or a wall, but it's a little wider and has more plantings within it. So just offering up that flexibility is something that could help with your existing regulations. Another goal and recommendation from your plan has to do with sort of gathering spaces, amenity areas, things of that nature, public spaces that could go along and become part of new developments within the city. And so we can do things with your existing zone or with your zoning districts that we sort of propose to retool in some ways to require certain amenity spaces in certain thresholds or sizes of development, and sort of spec those out in the code with standards that go along with them, and have them shown early on in the preliminary plat stage, or currently called a sketch plan stage, I guess, but we would propose a little change in the nomenclature there for at the preliminary plat stage, showing it for the entire development so that it's known in advance where this is proposed to be and kind of what its character is. So just as a sample from another community we've worked in, this is a part of their general residential district, their GR district. We list out, as you can see in this sample, different public amenity options and some percentages that would go along with them that would need to be part of a, like just a picture, residential development, would have to be worked into them, minimum percentages, so that they build up and add up to, a 15 to 25% range for different types of, 2 different types of development. And we give examples of what we mean in images, of course, so that it's, make more clear what we mean by a greenway or, a trail or a plaza and things like that. And different kinds of amenities might be different for different types of development. A more urbanized development, in a more intense or dense residential district or mixed use district, a plaza would be more, appropriate and doable than something like a large greenway or a natural trail. It kind of just wouldn't make sense in a more urbanized area. One more example, and there were many more in the actual report, but just pulling 3 for the purposes of this presentation. The plan has a goal and objective about practicing sustainable growth and environmental stewardship. And one way to do that is to encourage infill development. And infill development is making use of existing lots that have a street on them, are served by a sidewalk, hopefully, and have utilities serving them, all those things. But aren't being used for anything, or just kind of sitting vacant and not contributing to the tax base or anything like that. And so we can work in incentives for infill development so that, and these are again samples from other projects we've worked on, because obviously we haven't started on your project yet, that give bonuses in terms of the number of units per acre if someone does an infill development in the same zoning district. They don't have to change zoning districts. They can have, in a greenfield development for one district, they'd have a certain number of units per acre, but if they do an infill that's under that same zoning district, an infill development, they would get more units per acre, just as an incentive, because there's sometimes some costs to doing infill development that make it prohibitive, and that's why that property is sitting there unused and vacant. So giving them a few more units helps to offset that extra trouble and extra cost that would go along with doing that. So we're about to get into some more talk about potential changes to your zoning districts, and it's going to be taking your character areas that are in your comprehensive plan and talking about how your land development code can have reworked zoning districts that put the recommendations related to the character areas in the plan into reality. So I'm going to turn it over to Brett Keast. And Brett, I will keep advancing your slides as we go through these. So I'm going to step down and let Brett take over, hopefully.
All right, good evening. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Very good. Well, appreciate your time this evening. As you know, this is going to be a vitally important process. We look forward to working with you along the way to make sure that we're all on the same page and to talk through some of the concepts and potential changes and make sure that the Planning Commission is well read on the revision to the code. As Brian had indicated, that we're really looking a lot at the comprehensive plan, and as it relates to the zoning districts, particularly looking at the character areas. The character areas are spelled out in the comp plan that you may be familiar with, and basically they are geographic, and they basically spell out the different characteristics of these areas and the general types of primary uses and secondary uses. And we want that document to be something that is implementable. And so to do that, we want to build the zoning districts around those character areas. So in so doing, we look for opportunities to, as Brian was talking about, allow more development options within single districts to try to streamline and eliminate some unnecessary process where we can spell out, good standards without having to go through a rezoning process. You'll also see us really getting more into the look and feel of neighborhoods, more so the design and the form of development and how they relate to one another, as opposed to just simply looking at use. I think you can all appreciate that you can have a restaurant sitting on a pad site, out in the far northern reaches of the city, and you can also have one, in a mixed use development or downtown. The land use is identical, but the character or the setting is entirely different. So it's not really the land use that dictates that look and feel of an area, but it's rather, the design and the metrics that help create that type of environment. So this image on the slide shows the different character areas. Next slide, please. So this is basically what we've done to the district structure, we've broken this down into residential mixed use and then business and industrial. On the far left column, we are listing out each of the individual character districts, the areas, how they are currently zoned, and then the proposed zone. So to the extent practicable, we have tried to maintain your districts for a number of reasons. One is just to keep things simple because everybody's familiar with these districts and terms. And the zoning map will be the same, but what may change will be the standards within these districts. We'll start to hone in again on more of the design and form and densities and amenity spaces and things of that nature. So we'll give more structure to these individual districts. So you can see those that are highlighted in bold are what we're proposing as new districts. A residential estate district, while you have a R1 district that has 7,000 square feet, and people can have something larger than that, there's really no provision for estate-sized lots or executive housing. So we're proposing to provide a RE district that would be 1 acre lots. That's what we're proposing at the moment. And in that same district, they could also have 1/2 acre and 1/4 acre lots, but with increased amount of open space. So the density is generally the same, or we can have it just a little bit more so we can provide an incentive for setting aside common open space in exchange for having higher density. So we have the philosophy of if we're going to ask for something, we want to give something in return. So if we're asking for more greenways and open spaces and civic spaces and prairies and resource protection, we can give them some density in return. So acre, 1/2 acre, and 1/4 acre lots could all still be in one district. Today, they require 3 different districts. But again, there would be common open space. We'll talk a little bit more about that. The other is a residential village concept. This is essentially what's happening in your PUDs today. We believe that PUD is not necessary to get equal or better outcomes. And we can also make the process a whole lot simpler and more streamlined so that it doesn't take as long. There's fewer meetings, public hearings, etc. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as we get into it. We're proposing to keep your R1, R2, and MHP districts, but with some adjustments to the lot areas. And then we're also proposing for actually keeping the C2 commercial district, and then you see the RV zoning district again. Some places, these same districts can meet the need in some of the different character districts that are spelled out in the comprehensive plan. And then lastly, a stadium district. So generally, we have discontinued districts. We have discontinued 5 districts and rolled them into 1. We are keeping 6 of your current districts and we'll just kind of repurpose them. And then we're proposing 2 new districts, being the residential estate and the residential village. Next slide. So one of the things that we're looking at is in that North Airport area, which is outside the city limits today. It's zoned by the county. It's addressed in your comprehensive plan. And one of the things that we have some concern about is that the patterns may be established out there without the city having any influence on that. People can come in and request rezoning in the county over a course of time, and the area kind of gets sporadically developed, which will make it very difficult if this is supposed to be a future growth area for the city to establish logical road patterns and networks, as well as land use patterns, because you can have a whole variety of different types of developments and sizes of developments. The county has 4 different agricultural zones that are start at 35 acres, and they also have 10 acre, 2.5 acre, and 1 acre. So one of the things that we're proposing is, and we know that there's not utilities out there now, but we think there should be some conversation, maybe with some joint planning or joint zoning with the county in these areas to make sure that as things happen over time, that they will work well for the city as you continue to grow into that area. So we're proposing the ag district to have 4 options within it, which would mirror the districts in the county. But you'll notice that as the lot size goes down, the open space goes up. So again, we can go from having 1 unit to 16 units on 35 acres, but we also have 50% open space. So they're clustered much smaller, and we're maintaining a lot of open space so that we can preserve that kind of rural pattern. Next slide. So this is just kind of a quick aerial shot that kind of shows some of the emerging patterns that are happening out there. And it sneaks up on you, right? These things happen over a long course of time. Suddenly you look back and the whole countryside is kind of chewed up with a lot of different types and sizes of development. And, you know, the city hasn't had much influence on how that happens. Next slide, Brian.
Just a moment, Brett.
Yeah, I think, yeah, that's fine. Mr. Kamak, if you'll use, your microphone, Brett will be able to hear you better.
Can you hear me
Perfect,
okay? Good.
Yes, I can hear you.
Two areas that certainly are important in a lot of communities now around the country and have started to be in our area are ADUs and build-to-rents or horizontal apartments. Where would those two fit in what you have proposed here for our zoning?
That's an excellent question. You know, as you mentioned, ADUs, we're addressing those everywhere we go for several different reasons. Part of that is affordable housing. Those we would propose could happen nearly anywhere, provided that they have, you know, an adequate sized lot and they have enough rear yards so that they could be spaced away from property lines and easements and deal with privacy. And so we're not entirely overbuilding lots. Those could either be an in-house option, which we call a junior ADU, or it could be an over the garage, a converted garage, or if you want, it could even be a separate structure, kind of like a tiny home, except not on wheels. So we'll have to have some conversations about what and where you think those are appropriate. But we know we've had some earlier conversations and there seems to be some support for that. So we just have to, you know, make sure that we're not creating any problems with parking in areas that weren't really built for that. But we will certainly be addressing that. The apartments, we really got a couple options. Today you have your R3 and R4 zones, right? So you can have freestanding apartment complexes. We could continue to do that, or another option would be to provide them as a housing type within the residential village district. So in other words, they will be master planned so that they're stitched into the fabric of the neighborhood rather than being an after the fact. And as you probably know, those can sometimes be difficult to get approved. So we'll be talking more with staff about that. The residential village district, and I'll go over this a little bit in greater detail, but essentially we're looking at setting a maximum density and a minimum open space, and then creating a palette of different housing types, and then basically letting the development, you know, pick and choose from those housing types as long as they don't exceed the maximum density or provide less open space. If they choose to do more attached housing, they'll have to provide more open space because they're capped at that maximum density. This would allow us to not have the PUD process. It's liked by developers because it provides, you know, flexibility so they can respond to the market and they don't have to go back through and revise their PUD plans. And they don't have to rezone to a separate district. So we'll be talking a little bit more about that in the presentation.
Yeah, the build to rent, which is a whole bunch of nice houses built really close together. I'm sure you're aware of it. Started out in Phoenix, and you know, it's really spread across the country big time. One of the hottest types of buildings right now. seems to be very difficult to get through the building departments and get approval for that if they're not already in the LD code, or if they haven't had them before. Now we do have one here in Commerce City, and there's another one in Brighton that have been very, very successful. And I think it's important that we, address that in the Land Development Code.
Yeah, of course, we will address all the physical standards pertaining to that as a housing type. Of course, in a zoning ordinance, we're not necessarily looking at occupancy of whether it's owner or renter occupied, but regardless of what it is, we see some development have home or lots as small as 3,500 square feet. In your PUDs, your R1 district is 7,000 square feet. So basically, double the density, except they're doing a pretty good job of providing open space. So yeah, we can look at those, compact neighborhood types, but making sure that we're able to accommodate parking. And we're also able to accommodate open space. When you have that high density, it's even more important to have amenities and trails and buffers between different use types, et cetera. So we will absolutely be looking at that. I'm glad you brought it up.
I have a question as well on this chart. So in the central neighborhood, so I read central neighborhood as the core city in this chart versus northern
Yes.
neighborhood.
Correct.
Under the MHP, Mile High, MHP, I'll just leave it there. You have a definition of permit tiny home communities. And you said earlier that this plan would allow staff the ability to overrule the land development code. And when I read permit tiny home communities, I'm going to take it a step further to say for people experiencing homelessness. So you're kind of skirting the option to go to a zoning hearing to be able to place tiny homes in the core city for people experience homelessness. That's how I read this. What is the intent?
Well, regarding the manufactured home district, the MHP district, you have a few of them in town now. In some communities, they have allowed tiny homes to go, on the same spaces within that manufactured home park. We know that there has been, some interest in, having RV or tiny home villages. Potentially, tiny home village could be approved within a MHP district, provided that we have very good standards, so that we know what they look like, we know how it's going to be accessed, we know how we're buffering it from adjacent uses, we know how it's going to be parked, we know the types of common facilities that are available within there, so forth. So again, we're going to have some further conversations with y'all and with city staff as to, are tiny homes or a tiny home in a park-like of environment, is that acceptable if we have good standards? Could they go within a manufactured home park? In other words, somebody could pull a manufactured home park or manufactured home out and put in a tiny home, either on wheels or not on wheels. There's now provision in the building code for tiny homes. So we do have building standards for them.
But would this chart allow for a site that is zoned in the core city, I'm going to call it residential, for tiny homes that would not have to go before city council for a zone change?
No. The only thing that we were looking at was whether or not you wanted to allow them within an MHP. If anybody wanted to, have a tiny home community in another part of town, they'd have to go through the zoning process to rezone it to MHP and therefore public hearings. The only thing we'd have to have a conversation about is relative to ADUs and whether or not you would want to permit a tiny home in a rear yard. In some cases, in Littleton, for instance, they said that would be okay in those areas of town that have an alley. So they have alley access. So they weren't permitting them carte blanche across the whole city, but it's in certain areas. They wouldn't be tiny home on wheels, so we wouldn't want to put in a quote unquote temporary tiny home. It'd have to be, permanent on foundation.
I see Jennifer wanted to say something.
Hi, Brett. Jennifer Jones. Mr. Amador, I think I understand your question, if I may, and Brett can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think what I'm hearing your question is, just because a property or something is in what the comp plan is calling the central neighborhoods, it would not automatically mean that you could put up a tiny home community. It was simply saying that if the property was already zoned MHP or mobile home park, that we could write the standards so that mobile home park would allow tiny homes, which it currently doesn't, even though there are some similarities. But to allow a tiny home elsewhere for a property that wasn't already zoned mobile home park, that would not be doing that. So it would still have to go through a zoning process. So it would not be giving staff the ability to allow tiny homes anywhere. And the only exception to that would be what Brett mentioned, if we wrote some type of standards that allowed a tiny home as an ADU, which we're not quite that far yet. But from a zoning district perspective, does that help?
Yes, thank you.
Of course.
Thanks for that clarification. So this is how we start to break out, the northern neighborhood. You could have the RE district. And as I mentioned, a 1 acre lot would be required to have 10% common open space. So across 35 units, when you take out right of way and so forth, you get about 35 acres rather, you get about 30 units. If they did a half acre, they'd have to increase the open space by 20%. But you notice what happens to the maximum density and the number of units. So this is where we can use density bonuses to incentivize. We're not requiring that they provide a higher open space than what they're providing now. But if they see the market for half acre or quarter acre in this character, in a state type of character, they would have to provide that greater open space. Not to say that there couldn't be an area of town where there's, quarter acre lots that's intended to be more dense, that you wouldn't have to have as high of open space. But in this kind of a state type of character, that's what would be required in order to maintain that character. The RV residential village, this would be the single family detached and attached. I show your 7,000 square foot lot, which you have today, which there's very little built of in the city. Most of everything, as you know, is PUD. And I show that just as a way to show that if you have 5% open space, that gives you about 5 units per acre. And that's backing out the open space and also rights of way for roads. I think more commonly in your PUD areas, you have a lot of 4,000 square foot lots. Well, when you have that much density, in a compact area, you need more open space. Looking at some of the PUD plans that you have, it looks like open space is running somewhere between 10, 12 to 15%, depending on whether it's public and private. So we feel like we're not out of line with what's already being developed. So if you have a 4,000 square foot lot average, 15% open space, you can see that gives you almost 2.5 units additional per acre over the R1. But that 7.4 is probably about what you're getting today through your PUDs. And then we can do 1,500 square foot would be more of a townhouse type of product. And that would require 25% open space and would get you up to 14 units per acre. Again, these numbers, we need to have conversation to see, with the development community and with staff and with commission to see if the densities are, on target, if we need to make any adjustments. It's kind of first cut. And then also having a mixed use option within that RV, which would provide for your commercial element. But rather than having, out parcels and things like that, we would rather have it be master planned into an overall mixed use development. So you could have, even corner stores and small neighborhood, like facilities, as well as more commercial. We know a lot of the areas are being built out all single family, and there's some concern as to, making sure that we get commercial development. That really comes down to a market perspective. So we have a economic firm on our team, and they're going to be really helping us look at what is the market, how many rooftops demand, certain square footages or certain acreages of commercial, so that we can not demand too much out of developers when there's not a market for, a huge area. So we'll have to calibrate that as we get further into that economic study to really understand what the proportions should be between, different types of residential and commercial use. Again, as opposed to the old system of having R1 and R2 and then having C1 and C2, and you end up, having one-offs on corners, really planning for those commercial areas and building your roadway systems and trail connections and green spaces and buffers and things like that in as part of a master plan development. Next slide. So this is just kind of a illustrative that just kind of shows, how you can have different housing types mixed and matched. This would not require PD. This would not require individual zoning districts. This could all be done with a single zoning district, the RV, that has a housing palette so that they can pick and choose housing types, attached, detached, so forth and so on, and also have mixed use centers and other types of amenities throughout the development. Next slide, Brian. So as I talk about this housing palette, generally the idea is that we illustrate those. So in your case, you've got a lot of creative housing and you have housing groups also. So we can basically illustrate those and say, this is what a small lot or a larger lot, single family detached would look like, whether it's taking access from a street or from an alley or from a corner, and all the setbacks and so forth, and have just a whole palette of different housing types, attached and detached and so forth. Each of those equates to a density. When you look at that across the development, again, we can set the maximum density and say you can mix and match these things. We know with the housing palette that we're going to be able to park them. We know that we have adequate areas for, yards and for drainage and things of that nature. So you can really mix and match, which is largely what's happening now in your northern neighborhoods. The central neighborhood, as we just talked about, interestingly, which is not uncommon, we see, R1 and R2 zoning. In a lot of cases, what's zoned R2 is actually single family. So this would probably be the opportunity to clean that up if it's stable single family intended to remain as single family. So if we want to, preserve the integrity and character of those single family neighborhoods, we'd probably want to zone it appropriately. R2 areas, what we're looking at are for the areas that are already getting a mixture of duplexes and single family. There could be an opportunity to breathe some life into these areas with some new investment or reinvestment. So, if there's two lots together, you might be able to put, 2 or 3 units on that lot to get it on the tax rolls, but to maintain the character. One of the things we've done with staff is to look at the actual lot areas that exist today. And you may or may not be surprised to know that 93%, a large percentage of the homes do not meet your minimum standards today. So what we're proposing is the R1 to reduce it from 7,000 to 6,000 square foot minimum. And that would mean that 93% of all the homes would be conforming, not non-conforming. You have a very high percentage of lots today that are non-conforming simply because their lot area does not meet the minimum standard in your zoning ordinance. Similarly, in the R2, 3,500 square foot, be 7,000 square foot for 2 units. If you reduce that to 2,750, 97% of all the properties in that district would be conforming. So people go to get a mortgage, or they're wanting to refinance, they don't get tripped up with technicalities. So in this R2 district, we see that as an opportunity for areas where you could allow for single family, you could allow for duplex, you could allow for some multiplex of 3 or 4 units, and potentially even some townhome, to really kind of reinforce and strengthen some of these neighborhood areas.
Just a comment, if you reduce it so that 93% is conforming, one of the benefits of leaving it non-conforming is when the place is just a dump and we really want to upgrade the neighborhood and the area, you have the opportunity, if it's non-conforming, to cause some additional improvements to be done so that they can, add on a garage or have an expansion on the house. I'm not sure that we wouldn't want to try to keep that opportunity to upgrade if they're going to build something, as opposed to if they're conforming, then it's just coming in and getting a signature. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so let's say there's a single family home out there. It's been occupied by a family for 30 years.
50, 60.
And their lot on paper is non-conforming. It's been there, maybe even pre-existed the zoning when it was established at 7,000 square feet. So they're non-conforming on paper, but it's been that way forever. They want to improve their property. It's already non-conforming. So then they'd have to go through variances and through a process like that to try to make improvements to their property because they're already non-conforming. And as your ordinance and every ordinance says, you can't increase the extent of non-conformity. So if they want to add a family room or something on the back, they can't because they're non-conforming. So what we propose to do is to, in some of these areas, we can identify the things that you can do that would be okay. So maybe you can add a unenclosed porch on the front or a stoop. Or maybe you can add a family room on the back as long as you don't encroach into setbacks. You wouldn't change the character of the neighborhood from the street level. Nobody would see that. But that would allow them to add value to that home and to make it more livable. So we can spell out things and say, hey, here are the 6 things that you can do. And you don't need to go through rezoning or variances. You can just do them as long as you demonstrate to staff that you meet those standards. Improve your property. We're not going to stand in the way. So I think we want to, we're not going to go in and say, sorry, you're not conforming. You got to leave. You got to move out. In most communities, even if a house burns down, they're not willing to tell people they can't rebuild their house if that's what the only property they own. So it's a difficult situation. So I think neighborhoods and, single family in particular is maybe a little different case than it might be if we have an industrial use in the middle of the neighborhood. Yeah, we probably want to leave it non-conforming because it's city policy that eventually we don't want that use there. But a single family home in the middle of the neighborhood area, it's probably going to stay that way. It's just how do we enable them the easiest manner possible to invest and improve their property.
Well, in the core city, though, there are quite a few areas that have been used not only for a single-family house, but, their garage, and they've got 5, 10 cars in the backyard, and he's running a construction business out of there. And if you make that conforming, then it stays that way, and that's really not the direction that I think we want to go in trying to improve the core city.
We wouldn't be giving anybody a pass if they're operating a business out of their home and it's not quote unquote a home occupation. So we need to be very careful about how we define home occupation, what you can and cannot do. We also need to be very careful about overbuilding some of these small lot neighborhoods and ending up with the parking problem you have. So we need to look, very carefully at what we feel like we can accomplish to help rehabilitate or reinvest in these areas without, expanding on the problems. So usually we will say if you were lawfully permitted and lawfully constructed, then you could be conforming. But if you've done things outside the rules, or you're operating a business and you're not supposed to be, we're not going to give you a pass on that. You're still non-conforming, or that use will be non-conforming. And the R2 areas where we're looking at, if you wanted to, build a duplex, you could do that. If you could, if you had a lot size and you could do a 3-plex or 4-plex, or a up and down duplex or whatever that might be, you could do that. And I've got some graphics following this slide that kind of illustrate that. So this is the example of where we can say, here are the things you can do without requiring a variance, or without creating too much problem. And we illustrate them. I'm not saying these apply in Commerce City necessarily, just examples from other, these happen to be from another suburb, Centennial actually. But these are examples we can illustrate and say, hey, if you want to do these things and you stay within these parameters, you can do that. Get your building permit and go do it. But if you want to do anything that's in excess of that, you'd have to go through a process. Next slide, Brian. Again, looking at how homes are placed on the lot, how they are parked, where the garage might be, what type of space they have, and spelling out all of those parameters. Next slide. This is where we're looking at, we could have single family detached lots, or we could have single family and then a duplex, as long as it's designed. Maybe you don't care in some neighborhoods, but a lot of times they don't want mailboxes hanging on the front. They don't want 2 doors. You've done really well in the new neighborhoods where you have duplexes, but you can't even tell they're duplexes driving by. So we can have the same types of standards, so that you can have a duplex. Next slide. And this would be a case where, if there's a vacant lot, you could potentially add a third unit and create, essentially a townhome development. And this is just looking at kind of different ways that you can park these things, whether or not they have street access, or they have alley access, or they're on a corner, driveways or what have you. And the next slide shows those that have alley access of different options for parking, and whether or not, these garages, on an alley in particular, if they could be converted to an ADU, as long as they don't cause further parking problems in the neighborhood, or access for fire trucks, etc. The Community Connection District, I'll try to pick up the pace here a little bit so we're not going on so long. We've talked about the RV residential village district. This would be similar, but would be unique housing types and lot sizes for this area of the community. So again, you can have single family, detached, attached, and even multifamily with varying amounts of open space. We could also buffer between different housing types, even within the same district, if we're concerned about multifamily being next to, or in an area of vicinity of single family. But that's why we add, 30% open space if you want to do multifamily. And then also having mixed use TOD with standards, so that in your areas around your transit stops, you can build, walkable urban centers that are around TOD, so you can live and work and play all in the same district, and do that as part of the residential village zoning district. This is your Mile High Greyhound Park that's under construction now. A lot of different mixes of housing types, a lot of open space. You got a hotel under construction, so that kind of shows, what similar to what we would be after for, mixed housing types and so forth. Next slide. And this is, TUD, where you start to have greater concentrations of uses or buildings, different use types, street design, very walkable buildings brought to the street, using transit or structured parking as opposed to parking fields or lots. And again, amenity space is essential for the success of these areas. So creating a there, if you will. The stadium district, obviously major investment, fields, and the stadium. That probably is best staying at PUD just because it's so unique. But having a mixed use center around it so that people can come eat and recreate before, after events. So you can have office, retail, and vertical mixed. Potentially you could have upper floor residential. We have to kind of check on that because of the environmental conditions. And we have the neighborhood sub-district in here that's basically a reserve, if you will. So if neighborhood may be approved in this area, we would already have zoning for it. And have densities and open spaces and again, the different building types that would be allowed within these different areas. Again, just transitioning from housing types to building types. So what these things might look like, how they activate the street with transparency and openings, maybe outdoor plazas or green space or, sidewalk amenities, things of that nature, and then how they lay out on the land, how tall they are, how they transition to neighboring or abutting uses, etc. And then this is kind of the same thing for the business industrial. Again, the character districts. We're proposing some new districts just because they're so much different than what you have now with your I-1, I-2, I-3. So the DIA gateway, building out with very large footprint buildings. Most things are indoors except for truck docks and things of that nature. So that really doesn't fit any of the I districts that you have today. So we're proposing an industrial airport district or IA district. Any of the new districts, instead of the I and then a number, we're using, 2 letters to differentiate them. The innovation district would be kind of a campus, clean industry, if you will, technology park, which could be office, could be some light industrial, as long as it's all conducted indoors, research, things of that nature with, high standards. So again, the emphasis would be on kind of a campus type of environment. The E470 Expressway corridor provides really huge opportunity for, basically mixed use development. We're calling that a corridor campus. So that could be a blend of, neighborhood areas of different housing types and densities, as well as, business areas, all master planned up and down the 470 corridor. So we're not, piecing it out parcel by parcel, lot by lot, building by building, but really thinking of it in total and what the character of that area and the quality of the development is intended to be. The northern business basically could use your IA1 and I2 districts. So we just keep the I2 medium intensity, but we could have site development and design standards. Just thinking about how do we buffer and screen some of the outdoor uses, making sure we have hard surface parking lots for employee and visitor parking, maybe fencing or screening. Obviously, we can't just go in and tell them to do that, but if they want to pull a permit or even a business license, if you have that or anything like that, then that would prompt them to make some of these improvements. And we scale those improvements with the scale of what they're doing. So we don't, throw the book at them. If they're adding 15% to their building, we only make them bring certain things up to standard. But if they're scraping and rebuilding, then they would come to full standard. We don't want to create a burden if they choose not to make the investment, because they'd have to, add fencing and landscaping. The Fusion District, and, I think, again, the I-2 medium intensity district could be used there with, better standards for transitioning and buffering. Particularly where you have residential and industrial mix, to make sure that they play nice together and that they are good neighbors. And then the South Platte District, haven't decided yet whether that warrants a district or just an overlay. An overlay could be over whatever the zoning is, but making sure that anything that happens does not turn us back on the river and creates open space and public access and views of the river. And, we could prohibit certain uses to make sure that we don't have, intensive runoff or storm drainage that might be hazardous environmentally. So I'm kind of leaning towards an overlay district. We don't usually do overlay districts, but you've got a lot of public facilities in that area as well. So we'd maintain your public zoning district. So here we're replacing 2 districts with 3. We're repurposing and still maintaining 3 of your districts. And then there's, we just added 1 district, discontinued. And then we're proposing the 4 new districts. So all in all, there is 3 additional districts over what you have today. Generally, we like to keep them the same or even reduce if we can. But because of the comp plan and the different areas and characters that are described and what's happening, we feel like, we need to have districts that really portray what the vision is for these different areas. But we still can do by right options within districts so that we can streamline process. I don't know that we need to go through every single one of these in great detail. You have the presentation. We'll have more opportunities as we start drafting to get into them. So you can probably kind of slide through some of these slides, just looking at what standards could happen in different districts to make sure that you have the type of outcomes that you prefer. Innovation district, research, technology, creating kind of a campus type of environment where you have a higher landscape surface ratio or pervious area as opposed to many places. 470, we talked about having employment, having commercial centers, and having neighborhoods, effectively, kind of a master plan community, if you will, up and down that corridor. And having, high standards, good roadway systems, and ways for people to move both in vehicle and on bike and by foot. Northern Business District, again, fairly heavy, your I-2 district, but we can still use, good standards and signage and driveway access and things like that to make sure that we're making it as desirable and livable as it can be for what it is. Then your 270 Industrial District, most intensive industrial uses you have. It's kind of hard to do much. It's a tough area with all the truck traffic and dust and things of that nature. But essentially, I think what we would try to do is to create some standards and apply those standards as new things come in and as business change over and start to catch up on, some of the aesthetics and functional characteristics of these areas. Really thinking about that 270 corridor, what can we do with regard to, screening, something that would actually sustain. You've got several examples, in town today where you've done some nice landscaping. You've used different fence types, walls, things like that to screen. So we can tear a page out of that playbook and reuse some of these things that are already existing in the community. And just looking at, is there a way that we could create you know, a landscape buffer or something along your major roadways, so that we don't impose on the use necessarily, but we can provide some screening to soften the visual impacts along that area. Haven't gotten so far as to figure out the feasibility of that or the spacing or anything. And then making sure that as new properties come in, that we've got delineation of property boundaries, that we are looking at driveway approaches and trying to line them up, creating hard surfaces for employee and visitor parking that's delineated as opposed to gravel or dirt, using wall treatments, things of that nature. Fusion District, again, a lot of residential and industrial. You've got a lot of areas that are actually not even in the city limits. So we'd have to understand, you know, they're holding out for certain reasons. What might we be able to do to give them confidence that they could come within the city and, you know that there's going to be some standards to protect them. Again, looking at different landscape treatments that Brian was talking about earlier. And then the South Platte District, you know, looking at building heights and sight lines, flood resiliency, public access, lighting, so that, you know, you can make that area an amenity to the community over time. That is it for me. So a very long-winded summary of your district, but those are critical because that's kind of the DNA of the entire document. So it's really important that we get the districts right, we calibrate them such that they yield the aesthetic and the types of outcomes that the city desires, but also, you know, protect neighbors and their investments, but don't unnecessarily burden investors that are coming into the community. We've worked with hundreds of them all over the country. They all tell us the same thing. Set the bar where you're going to set the bar, we'll meet it, but move us through the process and treat us all fairly. So they'll meet the standards if we're clear about what the standards are and try to make objective standards that are written in black and white so they know what the expectations are coming into the process, rather than, you know, holding them up with a lot of discretion and back and forth and different messages from different players and departments. So just trying to make it a much better process. So I will pause there. I think, Brian, you were picking up from here.
Actually, Marcia will, but I wanted to offer up, we're right at an hour into this. We probably got about an hour to go still, maybe 45 minutes to an hour worth of slides. So would you like to, Mr. Chair, take an intermission or keep going? Up to you.
So I want to ask my commission if they would like to take a 10-minute recess or keep going. So show of hands to keep going. Show of hands to take a recess. Okay, keep going. There we go. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Brett. I don't know if you're still on. But great. So we're going to jump from the zoning districts into the rest of the code. So as Brett said, the zoning districts really set up everything that we'll talk about in the code. And we wanted to give you a quick overview of the different approaches to how you can write a zoning ordinance or LDC, and then show you how we kind of do the hybrid version of that. So the first is the land use-based regulations. These, as it says, you write it with land uses in mind. It's pretty easy to administer, but it doesn't take into account context, character, open spaces, some of those things that Brett's already talked about that we want to make sure we're considering when we're drafting. So we will be using land uses. It's of course important to say what you can and can't do on a property, but we don't write with just land use in mind. Another aspect that we bring into it is design. You've probably heard of form-based codes, and there are communities that want that for their whole code, and maybe it's appropriate in some places, but we use kind of the form-based section or just the design-based section for specific areas. So there are maybe certain zoning districts or parts of town that might deserve this treatment, but other parts it wouldn't be appropriate. So here we would be thinking of a very illustrative set of standards that you could apply to specific areas, in addition to the land uses, to show what is permitted within that zoning district.
In that particular genre of guidance is really where I would like you to see, or I would like to see you talk about BTRs, build-to-rent communities, because that's just one owner.
Sure.
And that's, 130 houses in 8 square feet. But they're nice houses, they're very close together, but they have
Right.
very nice amenities.
Yep.
Zonda, I'm sure you're familiar with Zonda. Zonda has some really great viewpoints and education, because that's a big stickling point on getting through the
Yep.
building process, the building permit process,
Yeah.
because it doesn't fit what historically we have had in our community.
Right. Yeah, Brett referenced the housing palette idea earlier in the residential village zoning district. And so that would be one where we'd be providing additional standards to say, for dimensions on homes and that kind of missing middle type of housing, to make sure that it is within the right character and stuff. So yes, we agree. Places like that, places like the Stadium District or Derby District might be candidates for something that's more design-based, but the industrial areas of town, we're not going to apply a design-based approach because that's not as appropriate there. And character-based is the third of those. This is something, there's kind of that, rural to urban spectrum, and all the things that you experience when you're on a property contribute to that. So the density, the open space, transitions, all those things are contributing to the character of that property. And while we're writing these regulations, we always have character in mind, but we'll apply it differently in different places. So again, we're taking that hybrid approach. We'll have land uses for all of the zoning districts. We'll talk about those in a second and how we structure the land uses to be very clear and very easy to administer. The design-based approach we will apply throughout the code because we want it to be more illustrative, easier to interpret and apply. But then there are certain parts of the community that might get the more, I'm not going to say it's going to be form-based, but they might have a little bit more of those dimensional standards like you were saying. And then, of course, character we'll keep in mind as we're drafting all the zoning districts. So getting into those land use standards, right now you have the by right, use by permit, and conditional land use standards. There's a little bit of confusion between them because there are standards written that accompany uses that are in each of those 3 categories. What we like to do on the right-hand side is to have categories that are clearly standards or no standards. So if it's a by right use, we do not include standards for that. It just means that it's allowed and staff can administer that. It doesn't have to go through a hearing. It's a by right use. If there need to be standards that are involved, that would be a limited use. So your use by permit name would change to limited use. And instead of it going to the BOA, we would propose that it's administrative approval based on the standards that are written and approved for that particular use. So it does go through review that's administrative, not a public hearing, and has specific standards it has to meet to get approved. If it needs a public hearing, that's when it goes to conditional use. Again, there are standards provided for those that would be very clear, very easy for council to apply and make an action based on the standards, but that one would require public hearing. So that's sort of how we propose to adjust some of those land use standards just to clarify things, make it a little bit more administrative where possible, and speed things up that can be sped up, but of course keep those conditional uses because we know there are things that always need to go to public hearing. So we'll kind of have those 3 groupings. We also will be updating the land use matrix. This is just one excerpt of your existing land use matrix just to show that one thing we always try and do is consolidate the specific use types into those use classifications. We refer to them as use categories, but same thing. And we try and find places where there's repeated, either permitted by right now, or maybe it's a conditional use, and that we can kind of collapse some of those. And so instead of listing out those 3 specific use types, for instance, those would be consolidated into what is called this all other retail establishments, in this case, not listed above. And if your use is not listed above this, you would then go to your use category table. And you can see that there's a long list of primary uses and then some accessory uses that accompany those. But instead of listing out every single one of those primary uses in the land use matrix, we list them here. And then things that need specific treatment can be listed in the land use matrix. Otherwise, you just say you follow the all other category and look at the table here. And there is a caveat on the bottom of this. There's always a section that says other uses meeting the characteristics of that particular use category, because we know that as soon as we adopt this, there's going to be another type of office use that we're all not thinking about, or in 5 years there will be something. So we don't want to box them out if it's something that you want in the community. But it gives the director some of that discretion to determine whether or not it meets the characteristics of the category and could be approved. ADUs, here's your slide about ADUs. As Brett mentioned, there's been a lot of interest already in ADUs, and so we want to explore that and figure out where exactly they should be permitted. He mentioned that we always have standards that accompany them. These are 3 examples of standards that we often utilize. Limiting the number of ADUs per lot, and it's often that it's 1 per lot, but we can discuss that more. We also limit the size of the unit, and it could be that it's just a hard and fast number, square footage for that size. It could be that it's a percentage of the primary structure square footage, or it can be a combination of both, so that you set a maximum based on either the percentage or just a hard and fast number. And then another thing to consider is whether we require that the property owner live on the property, either in the primary structure or in the ADU. So that's always something that is a point to discuss. There's other things too, like if you have a detached ADU as shown in the yellow on kind of one of the far right examples, there might be a distance requirement from the primary structure. There can be a variety of standards that we include here, but I would say these 3 are probably the most common things that come up when we discuss these. So we talked a lot about standards. We use this term a lot to apply to a variety of different parts of the code. We've covered the use standards that are in the proposed Article 3. The development standards Brett talked about for each of the zoning districts. So that accompanies the zoning districts. But then we also have design standards, and that's in the proposed Article 4, and that can address anything from specific building types, like the build-to-rent ideas, to site design items, signs, and anything else you think of fits within that design standards category. So I'll just go over a couple examples here. Again, the building design standards could address specific building types, but it may also just address specific topics, which is common for those non-residential buildings. So identifying entry locations through articulation. There may be cases where you want to reduce the perceived length of a very large building, and you could do so by having some articulation, some step backs and setbacks, create some shadow, activating the building, maybe putting in windows or other strategies to increase transparency, just make it a little bit more pedestrian friendly. And of course, those will be applied differently based on the zoning district you're in and the building type, because we'll have a higher standard for those for, say, mixed-use buildings than industrial buildings. So we'll be considering all of that when we write these design standards. Again, this is just a sample of some topics that we may include for residential design standards. Garages, we often talk about how many buildings can have a garage that's flush with the front wall. We talked about the housing palette idea already. For multifamily, communities often want us to think about the number of units and breaking up the building itself. So creating a max number of units, or maybe just a volume, max volume, so that you're minimizing these giant multifamily buildings that can happen if you don't create that max. Mixed use and wrap style buildings. Brett had some structured parking examples, so we often want to talk about structured parking that has a use around it, so it's not just a parking garage out in the middle of a development. So we'll talk about that in a minute too. And then of course, illustrations. We'll be incorporating a lot more of those as we go. This is just one example of a specific building type that we wanted to make note of, because it is one of the newer building types, we know you guys already have these on the ground, but there are ways that we could improve that design outcome. The dual frontage idea is that, most of these are facing that shared drive in the middle right now, but if we create a dual frontage for the end properties that face the street also, maybe their front door is not facing the street, but if they had at least a porch or something that is creating that connection between the street and the building, it's following the pattern of the neighborhood a little bit more than just facing it towards the drive in the middle. That kind of goes with that front entry and walkway too, that we want to make sure it's clear where the front entry is, that you're not just walking into the garage, because some of them right now just read as that's how you enter the building. The garage door could have a little bit more articulation, maybe transparency. There's a lot of ways we could address that, but just making that a little bit more interesting so the whole ground floor that you see, especially for the back units, isn't just one solid mass. And of course, these building type specific standards for this building type, but others as well, have a lot of benefits. A lot of times it's just to activate the pedestrian realm and make sure that there are eyes on the street, that it's clear where the entry is, that there's visibility, and that you're breaking up the mass of buildings too. So we'll be kind of addressing these for a wide variety of building types, but wanted to call this one out because it's a newer building type, but we know that you're seeing it already and want to make sure that you're improving that building type as we go forward. So like I mentioned, industrial design standards for the building are going to be very different than your residential or mixed use standards. These are two examples that we could consider that you would address building materials or roof material. Maybe there are incentives for including green roofs or solar panels on the roof. You've got a lot of building there, so why not try and use that productively? Bulk is something that we could include too, that in addition to height and setbacks, maybe there's a max FAR just to reduce the size of that building. So we won't go crazy on the building design standards for these, but did want to propose a couple ideas. And then the stadium district, like Brett talked about, there's a lot of considerations for this one. Use is the first one. We know residential is kind of up in the air, but here we've focused on retail, entertainment, public spaces, civic spaces, and all the things that could happen within the stadium district. For the development standards, it really then moves to making a walkable environment, place that has buildings that are very articulated and people want to spend their time in. And then this is just one sample, again, of the parking structures that we know it would be advantageous to have a parking structure in a place like the stadium district, but we wouldn't want to see that it's just a standalone parking structure. We would make sure that it's a wrap structure that has at least commercial uses. We can talk about residential later, but at least some uses around it to make sure that it's woven into the design of the entire district. So then we go on to site design standards, and again, this kind of goes through a lot of different potential topics. We'll go through a couple of them pretty quickly. So the industrial building design standards are pretty light, but the site design standards may be a place where we can talk a little more in detail and get some better site improvements. And as Brett said, it's an opportunity to think about those non-conforming sites, and if they're pulling a permit for a small addition or something to improve their property, maybe that's where we try and get them to do some paving, do some landscaping and buffering, and that's for existing sites, of course. So if there's a new development, then whatever landscaping and buffering standards that are written in this, they would need to apply. So site design, we can probably go a little further for these industrial sites than the building design itself.
Question for
question.
you.
Yeah.
On non-conforming sites where, say for instance, they want to do a small addition on a large lot, and I'm just going to say it like that, and then we just need to be cautious that we're not turning a small addition into a paving project. So
Sure.
are there thresholds that you're considering around
Yeah.
paving, landscaping, screening, and drainage? And how do you handle that in
Yeah,
this kind of non-conforming site?
Sure. Yeah, that's a good question. We do include thresholds that say, of course, if you do new construction, you've got to apply everything. But then if you're doing maybe so many square feet or something, then you kind of go up in how much you have to apply. So we haven't worked through all that quite yet, but we do include that to make sure that you're not kind of blowing a project out of the water when it's really just a small improvement. And we've also talked just this week with staff about the possibility of making a faster process for something like that too, so that if it's a small project, maybe staff could review it. Again, it would have to have thresholds, but something that could go through faster than having to go up to city council and take a lot of time. So all things that we're exploring. Another section that we'd want to add in here that's really focused on screening is the outdoor display and storage. You've got land uses that deal with this, but talking about screening these so that they're just a little bit out of view would be an improvement. So we would include this section as well. Xeriscaping is something that we've heard a lot about throughout the project already and just talked to some more people about today. But finding ways to either require or incentivize it. We know that the city manager's office has some people doing some research on this right now because city council directed them to. So I think their research is supposed to wrap up in the fall, and that will coincide with our timing for drafting this section of the document. So we'll get with them to see what they found, what city council wants to move forward with, but figuring out ways to improve the plant list, whether it's xeriscaping or not, but also just to think about water usage in landscaping for new development. And we've heard too that there's some existing, there's existing development and residential development that people would like to consider xeriscaping to replace their existing landscaping. So that's something that we'll be considering as well. Signs, the sign section, we know that you've recently updated your sign section, so we'll mostly utilize that. We'll update it as needed. Illustrations is one part that we know it would benefit from, so we'll be including those, and then again, looking at it for any other minor changes as we need to. Parking is something that we always revise based on the ITE standards. We're always looking at how to modernize those. We know that electric vehicle charging is something we need to take into account as well. And of course, communities range from wanting to have just minimum parking standards to having minimum and maximum parking standards to maybe just having maximum parking standards. Or sometimes no parking standards if they just want the developer to figure out how much parking they need. So anyways, there's a wide range of how communities want to address this. But with maximums particularly, there are a couple ways you can do that, that a soft maximum, if they went over that maximum, they would have to then incorporate additional landscaping, xeriscaping, amenities, whatever you chose to include. But there would be a maximum. They would just have to do some additional things if they exceeded it. And then of course the hard maximum is just, that's it, and you can't exceed that. One other parking related item is just thinking about the site itself and how you incorporate parking lot landscaping. And we know you've got some on that already, but we want to think about it even more, and especially how, in an example like this, it's just a wide open parking lot. It's hard for people to navigate, it's dangerous, and it's really hot. So there are easy ways that you can just, make some small landscaping improvements, divide it up a little bit more, become safer, and hopefully a little less hot in the summer months. So incorporating that and making sure that larger parking lots have that landscaping will be something that we'll include. Low impact development and sustainability is also something that we'll include. We often do a sustainability index, or here it's in this example, it's called a sustainability point system. Lists out a wide range of things that a developer could do, and they get so many points associated with that. And often a community will say, if you get so many points, you can then trade it in for more height, more density, whatever that list of things is that we determine. But you could figure out how to incentivize incorporating LID and sustainability measures for them to then get something that they want on their end. All right, turn it over to Brian.
Okay. Thanks, Marcia. And this last part of the presentation deals with the procedural parts of our thoughts on the Land Development Code update, and showing you just an overview of the annotated outline and the proposed structure of the code. So there's definitely a light at the end of the tunnel here at this point. For streamlining, breaking it down kind of to two bigger categories, more administrative authority and then just kind of clarification on certain things. We've said it several times, building in administrative authority. Of course, with the city council being the group that would approve the LDC update, it's going to depend on how much they kind of want to delegate some things to staff for their approval. There's some things that can never be staff approved, like a rezoning or a conditional use permit, but there's other opportunities to have staff to have more final decision-making authority. Changing what you call currently a sketch plat or sketch plan to what's really, in my experience, much more common terminology of a preliminary plat would be another suggestion or recommendation that we have, where and with that preliminary plat, it would go to you all and to City Council for final decision on a preliminary plat. But when it's time for the final plat, if the final plat complies with the preliminary, then then it is staff approvable, and even go so far as to say not eligible for a call-up to City Council. We've heard some frustration about that from all types of people, not just applicants, and that would be probably a pretty great win if we are able to get that. And it's going to mean that the preliminary plat is scrutinized and has standards that apply to it for sure, of course. But once it's through, then a developer or an applicant has some confidence that their investment is going to be able to be followed through with.
So that provision absolutely warms my heart, and I would support not eligible for call-up.
Okay.
Thank you.
Not often that we hear something zoning related warms someone's heart, but that's always a good sign, I guess. So yeah, not eligible for a call-up. Concurrent processing of a preliminary and final plat together could be something we look at as well for smaller projects. We could call it, like a minor plat where there's 5 or so. 5 is a common number. 5 lots being created, or whatever that number is, 4, 5, 6, something like that, on an existing street with, that doesn't require new infrastructure, could go that way and be another administrative decision, final action that could be done. And then talking with staff, there's currently just a development plan procedure that is not sensitive to scale or size or complexity or anything like that. There could be a minor development plan process that would be shorter, administratively approved for smaller changes like the smaller expansions that Marcia was talking about based on the chair's question. For clarification, the development review team, we're still thinking about that and learning about that and its function. I think there's been some progress on that front without us, outside of this project, but just making sure that their role and the timing of their referrals and decisions are up to speed. Consolidating, similar to the minor development plan, I guess, sort of consolidating the PUD development permit and the development plan process is the bigger development plan process, not the minor one, into sort of one catch-all that could operate under kind of one procedure and be an administrative process is another thing that would warrant some more consideration.
So around the procedures, just looking at this, understanding not only Commerce City, but other municipalities looking for efficiencies, especially with, I would just say, limited staff or resources at times to make the process go faster, because the process for PUDs and all of these things that are outlined here take time, even though we can run them concurrently. These efficiencies that I'm seeing here are a good thing related to speeding up some of the, I'm gonna call them developments that happen with all the processes and procedures that need to happen.
Yeah.
So, thank you.
Yeah, and I know that staff internally is doing some sort of internal policies and internal practices where they are speeding up the turnaround between giving out comment or them giving comments, getting revisions, reviewing again, and if there's any remaining comments, getting those out and or taken care of that are sort of apart from this, but complement our recommendations well.
Does your presentation at some point talk about PUDs, what the guidelines are, how to do it, how we should look at it, and so on and so forth? Because frankly, when you take a look at the difference between zoning and subdivisions and PUDs, a lot of the stuff can get confused and is a PUD just what somebody wants and convince somebody that that's what is best, or do you address that in?
Well, in this particular presentation at this point doesn't really get into that topic, but something we've probably said throughout is sort of trying to rely as much as we can in the new code on the written standards that are spelled out, written in place in black and white, so that they might be more thorough than what you have now. And so we hope that results in less reliance on plan unit developments because a person has the expectations are spelled out in the code for quality development. And with those options Brett was showing within the different districts, the village or the other types of options within a single district, we hope that that flexibility is going to reduce, probably can't ever totally eliminate a PUD, even like for the stadium, Brett kind of admitted that the stadium district PUD might still be the appropriate way to go. But if we can reduce the amount of PUDs that are needed or that people even think they need, because we've heard some stories of PUDs being proposed that really there's no reason, that discernible reason, especially on the ground, if you looked at the finished product of why it was ever a PUD to begin with. Or
We have some horror stories.
yeah, maybe I almost said that, but didn't quite say that word. Yeah. Or really small properties that, PUD, and ideally the textbook scenario is that it's a kind of large, complex thing that doesn't fit within the regulations. And that's kind of the only safety valve that the applicant has to try to do a unique project. Well, we want to cover within the code a lot of different options that are by right, so that, again, that PUD option becomes less necessary and more uncommon and rare than maybe what you're seeing now. But we'll definitely be, as we're drafting, working on when the PUD process is needed, making it as clear as possible and even setting some parameters maybe for size of the minimum size of the project, like if it has to be a larger project in order to be able to do a PUD.
Thank you.
Yep. RLUPA, Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act, is something for us to be aware of while we're drafting it. Mainly, the bottom line is that you can't treat churches more harshly or other religious institutions. You have to treat them on the same footing as you treat lodges and clubs and other non-religious assemblies of people. So, that's sort of the bottom line, but not treating religious institutions differently from non-religious institutions when it comes to people kind of assembling under a common interest and doing things together. You can't discriminate, of course, on the type of religion that a particular property is proposing to have on it, whether it's whatever religion it is that's proposing to be accommodated there. You can't discriminate on that basis, and that's usually not a problem. Most places that's more, but it is something to remember. You can't totally exclude religious assemblies from a city, and that's usually not an issue either. And then just overall not unreasonably limit religious assemblies and institutions and structures, just treating them basically the same, on the same footing as other secular things. So some solutions to that, or some ways to make sure that happens, we think, is to have a land use, or at least a land use category that might have some specific things underneath it that are all treated the same, really, of public place of public assembly or something along those lines. Different terms would mean the same thing, but basically or public institutions, something like that, that just gets treated, it's like clubs, lodges, neighborhood clubs, boys clubs, girls clubs, churches and mosques and temples would all be under the same treatment and under the same umbrella. Making sure that your conditional use permit standards for these places, are basically the same, and just treating them all as a public assembly and not differentiating in parking requirements between a place of religious worship versus a secular place of assembly. Neighborhood meetings is something that could use a little more clarification. The current code we find to not be very as precise as it could be on when neighborhood meetings are required. This is the process where an applicant knows they're going to do a project, and in some cases for bigger projects or for more significant projects, they have to have a meeting in the area, generally speaking, where they are proposing to have this project happen. They have to invite surrounding property owners. Property owners can come or not come, it depends, and sort of take notes and provide those notes with their application is usually the kind of how it works. There's some sort of vagueness about when these are required and for what types of projects they're required for in our reading of the existing regulations. And so just spelling out when they're required, whether it's for any rezoning or any conditional use permit, or setting thresholds like, a project that's over 5 acres in area. If it's non-residential, then it would have to have a neighborhood meeting, or if it's over 100 lots or 100 dwelling units, if it's multifamily or duplex or something like that, then that being a threshold, so setting a threshold for when that's clear for when neighborhood meetings are required and for what applications, what development applications they apply to. Then there's just some miscellaneous things. We got a lot of these from talking to Mr. Hayter, from the Office of the City Attorney. These were kind of part of some wish list stuff that he had, or maybe some of them are also from our own observations. But there's some federal rules about timing of providing decisions on telecommunication towers that we want to make sure are worked into the new code. Reimbursements for when the city has to have an expert in a niche area review certain submittals, such as a traffic impact analysis, or maybe there's other things. Noise studies is a common one I've seen other places where an applicant might provide a noise study that is pretty technical and would be Greek to a lot of people dealing with decibels and things like that. So requiring a reimbursement from the applicant if the city has to hire a third party to review something. The conveyance plat process, which is where the applicant or the landowner for whatever reason needs to have a plat done of the property, but doesn't intend to develop it anytime soon. Maybe they need to get the plat done in order to sell the property, or to transfer ownership, like I said, or for whatever reason that they have, so that it can be platted, but it's clear that it's not being set up at this point for development. They would then have to do the normal preliminary plat and final plat, but it would kind of set the boundary for the property and things like that, and get recorded, with the county. The process for revoking permits or other approvals is currently more open-ended. This is something we learned from Mr. Hayter about revoking permits and approvals and having a more clear process for that. The decision criteria, we heard this from a few people, when the council is approving a conditional use permit or a rezoning, there's often there are review criteria in your current regulations that are pretty vague or pretty open-ended. And the council, if they're going to approve something, just kind of finds affirmatively on all these different criteria, and it's usually fairly easy. When they want to deny, they have to kind of get creative or base what they heard at the hearing or what their own thoughts and opinions are on what's being proposed, and sort of create findings of fact that are that are contrary, that say why it should be denied. And so that is, that could be some help. There could be some help in the code for that, and there could also kind of be potentially some behind the scenes help that could be provided to council members or to you all, even if you do that, if you make findings on certain things. And then helping be more clear and maybe a little more definitive about when applications become inactive or are considered withdrawn or void due to inactivity. We always want to build in the ability probably to have an applicant request more time, and there might be limits on how many requests they can ask for more time to get a project going. But it's, just when a project and when approved project is sitting and doesn't have any activity going on it for extremely long periods of time, things change around it, rules might change, and so there becomes a point where most people would agree that, okay, this is kind of a dead project and needs to be sort of, if it's to continue, then the owner needs to end up reapplying when the time comes that they're ready to start doing it again. Okay, more user-friendly features. I kind of mentioned this earlier, how this code is going to be sort of native to the internet. It's going to itself be a website as opposed to a static PDF. We can publish drafts, especially toward the end when the staff and the city overall is really ready for the public to look at the document. We'll be able to publish it online, and it would be, as we said, interactive. Able to search, able to hover over, like I said, that word effective date in this sample. Hovering over that word gives a definition of what we mean by that term effective date. It would still be printable and downloadable for people who would want to print. It can have calculators, like you can enter what your zoning district is, what the adjacent zoning district is, how long the property line is between the two properties, and it would output the amount of trees you would need for that particular buffer, the amount of shrubs, the amount of large trees versus small trees, and all these other things that are helpful when someone's trying to kind of figure out if a project would pencil out. So yeah, very friendly. Here's a quick view of some of the features on an actually adopted code for another community, just different heavy use of graphics, heavy use of tables, the pop-up definitions, and all these other features that are usually pretty appreciated by communities. Okay, the final part of this is to go through the annotated outline. As I said earlier, we like to put at the front of the document, the things that people, the lay users like to know the most about what uses they can have, what they can build, where the building has to be. These are all very helpful, we find, and then having kind of the technical stuff, the design standards and the review procedures toward the back of the document. This is a rough overview, and our actually submitted annotated outline has much more detail than this, but this is sort of how we view the highest level, the articles of the document to be organized, where we've got standards with standards, procedures with procedures, definitions all together. Stuff like that.
Let me ask you a question on that. The Colorado chapter of American Planning Association says that our planning, our land development code ought to address impact fees and extraction fees, as well as the environmental issues, and the big one is water, which you already talked about a little bit, but water is becoming one of the huge problems here in Colorado, because virtually every other state gets it from somewhere other than God. We're the only ones that get it from God. And I don't see, especially the impact fees, and you've probably heard about all of the problems of up north. The taxes are so high because of the way they finance the public improvements. Is that addressed in here at this point, or do you think it's important to?
Well, we wouldn't be, as part of this project, calculating impact fees or proposing new impact fees or changing any impact fees you might already have. A reference to your impact fees could be, saying something like that. And usually, I don't know how your code is arranged, but usually the impact fee kind of ordinance or provision lives in a different part of the overall city code that the land development code is a part of, but it might say something like, prior to getting a building permit, the applicant shall pay, the impact fee required in section XXX of the city code somewhere else. And we would have, could have a link to that would take the reader to that part of the city code, but we would not be calculating or
You talk
proposing.
about various ways to get the public improvements financed. Because if you don't, basically anybody we can all come up with visions, they call them dreams until you know how to get there.
Yeah.
And, if we want beautiful buildings, financing and the development fees are certainly a critical part of that.
We would have standards for public improvements. We would not have something about how those are financed. We would have, provisions for bonding when a developer is putting in new streets, performance bonds and maintenance bonds, performance bonds to ensure that they actually build the street, maintenance bonds to ensure that for a year or two, that it's a quality street and then after that 2 years, the city has the responsibility of maintaining it. That's the closest this document would get. And I see there's that Article 8 development fees article. That could be where some kind of references to your existing impact fees live. That could be where there's some discussion of submittal fees, but that's just, that can be handled in a paragraph.
See, I don't think you need to be setting fees, but I think this
Yeah.
document needs to be talking about the different ways so that when somebody comes in and wants to do a development, they know at least the options that we consider. And, before they get in and say, oh, we're not going to do that, or, Are you aware of the issues in the north end? Has that come up in any of your discussions?
They may have. At the moment, I don't recall about the issues on the north end, but related to this specific thing with fees.
Talk to that man on the end over there.
Okay. Yes, sir.
I would just add, possibly in the development fees, I've heard in the past that a developer will come in and say, okay, I want to do this, 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 this. And then when they finally come to apply for their permit, then they get impact fee, development fee, all these feed to death, if you will. And they're like, I didn't realize I was going to pay, $60,000 in development fees and this and that around development fees. And then maybe I know that South Adams water's always a challenge as
right.
well. And would that be somewhere related to how we show people, this is where that's at, go look at it?
Yeah. Well, so we met with, I guess it was yesterday, with the water district, and they were glad to be brought on board to this project, and that we were, wanted to hear from them. I'm based out of Texas. I know water is a very precious commodity for development. So we talked a lot about some kind of bigger picture things with them, and then there were some more specific issues we talked about with the water board. They'll be involved in reviewing drafts of this document. The water board will be, and we welcome their input. I'm not, so that's kind of, part of it. As far as, again, the development fees, and I guess that's an existing piece of the current code. A lot of it would be brought over. I mean, if there's more clarity that's needed, we're happy to provide that, to that particular article on development fees. But I just want to emphasize, we're not creating new fees or providing an opinion on if they're adequate currently. That's just not what we do.
So I would just say, related to South Adams water, when I was on council, I don't know, we probably did it in 2015, 16, something like that, where we did 10 different building types, a single-family residential unit, a car wash, 10 different building types, if you will, and ran a study across what the water fees were related to South Adams water versus where Denver gets their water and they have an advantage. And really what was noted was that the water fees were double of what Denver was. So all of the development happened on the Denver side, if you will, because 1 inch water tap, I'll call it 1 inch or whatever it is, 4 inch for or a 2 inch for a brew pub was just becomes cost prohibitive.
Yes.
And I think on the front end where a developer comes in and says, hey, I want to do a brew pub. And then we say, yeah, but everything's good. Go talk to South Adams Water. And they go, my water tap is how much? I'm going to go over to Denver and kind of go that route. So I would just caution that in development fees in your conversation without South Adams Water, that those fees are upfront and known so that staff doesn't waste a lot of time in trying to get things done and the deal gets killed on the tail end. So.
Yeah, now that you mentioned that sort of in that context, I do remember it coming up of some large tap fees that we've heard about. And if nothing else, if we can have as much, having that article on development fees, have it as a clearinghouse for, where all the, at least referencing the different fees that could come into play, then we would definitely be open to that. It's just changing them or recommending changes to specific dollar amounts wouldn't be part of
Well, I
what
think
we're-
good guidelines as to how to determine those costs are more important than coming up with numbers, in my view. And the same with extraction fees, where a builder comes in and it's our responsibility to make sure that he puts enough parks and gives the right amount of land to the school district and so on and so forth. Those are important things that should be upfront and bright and flashing for people that want to do things in our community. And historically, they haven't been. And that's created problems. And, up north, we have extraordinarily high taxes, property taxes and development fees and all of the different things that we have used to build the community. So the house is cheap, but your tax bill is $8,000, as opposed to you go down to Parker, same house, the tax is, the house is $50,000 more, but they're paying $3,000 or $3,500 in taxes. And it is that big of a difference, and that needs to be up front and center when somebody comes in and wants to do a project.
Okay. All right. We will keep that in mind as we're working through. This is a timeline. We're kind of, I guess, at this point, kind of leaving task 3 and getting into task 4. But then task 4 is a year long before we get toward August of next year, where we would be looking at adoption. There will be a lot of back and forth in task 4 where we provide a draft to staff of each of the modules. They give us feedback. We incorporate the feedback. It then goes to a bigger group of people. The first round is like specifically planning staff, then it goes to a larger group of people for their review, and then we take their feedback and work it in, and then we put the modules together into a single document, public hearing draft, basically, that then is what you all will be reviewing. You'll get updates along the way like we're doing now, but you'll have the public hearing draft that's going to be, the basis of the hearing that would happen, basically around August or July of next year. You'll make a recommendation with any changes that you would want to see, and then the council gets that and then acts on it. And then again, hopefully August of next year, you'll have a new code as part of this process. And we're also doing a development guidebook, that task 5. That is a document it's also an online, native to online document where procedures are spelled out more with kind of like flow charts and even more easier to understand version than what's in the actual rule book of the Land Development Code. So it's illustrated with tables, charts, flow charts, stuff like that to explain the different review processes. It's not about the standards really, it's more about the processes that get into the development guidebook.
Is that going to be a platform that is easily adaptable to their new online applications for building permits?
Yes, we've done that before with other cities where we can, I mean, it'll depend, it's gonna be we'll have to work with staff to figure out how to make it work, but we've made it work before where the development guidebook connects with the online permit review and submittal platform that the city has.
Are you interviewing and spending some time with the opinions of some of our major developers, not only Oakwood, but the commercial guys and the landowners that are out there that, don't have quick plans, but have dreams? And tell us about your input.
Yeah, more in task 2 it would have been. So earlier this year, we had a couple of trips here where we spoke with the kinds of people you listed, design professionals, attorneys, larger landowners, developers, engineers, to get their feedback, on what's working well, what's not working well, what they would love to see change, what they don't want us to mess with, as far as your current regulations go. And, I'd have to think for a moment to remember, what we heard, because that was probably in February or March. But, we took notes, and we'll use that as a basis for the changes we propose in the code. Usually you can count on sort of hearing about timing and timeliness. And streamlining is very common to hear from, applicants, and that's understandable. And they are often glad to know that we believe in sort of as much administrative authority as possible. Often, once they kind of wrap their head around the different development options within a district, within a zoning district, then they kind of latch on to that, because they see that if they set aside, open space more than what they would need to, then they get a bonus of more lots or more units out of the deal. So they are often attracted to that as well. So yes, we've talked to them, and our notes will help inform what we propose in the draft that we work on.
One of the things that was discussed, be 13 years ago now, and the comprehensive plan that was, excuse me, that was put into place then was talking about the type of development around E470 up, between us and the airport. And one of the recommendations that was heard from the community but wasn't done was to put fiber optic or fiber in that, and we had the opportunity to do it, as part of the infrastructure was there to do it. It was not done, and quite frankly, that's cost us some opportunities to bring folks in. What is your input in terms of technology as it, impacts development and the land use?
I don't know if the city has what comes to mind for that, I guess, nowadays is small cell towers. I don't know if the city has any provisions related to those right now, but they're, I don't know the height, 20, 25, 30 foot tall towers that are kind of placed more frequently, more densely in a city. And there's some places where you probably wouldn't want them, but they help kind of boost the cell signal in the area. And they're often in the right of way because they're, again, smaller towers. We've provided those in some of our regulations, requirements related to those in some of the products we've worked on. We often have something in the parking requirements about vehicle charging and giving some parking credit if you provide, You get basically provide one, you get credit as a parking space, even though it might not be a parking space that everyone can use, at least they can get a parking space credit for that. Or even if you wanted to give a parking space and a half credit for providing charging stations like that. That's not infrastructure really, that's more on the private property, but those two things come to mind. I don't know if that's kind of what you're looking for, but those are two kind of examples of what we've done in other places.
Is there any place in terms of process around, well, let me set the table first. So Commerce City lives within Adams County. We have a whole bunch of lots that are vacant and could develop. However, they are in unincorporated Adams County. And traditionally what would happen is a landowner would say, hey, I want to develop this property. The property is in unincorporated Adams County, yet I'm in Commerce City, okay? And everything around it is kind of annexed into Commerce City. So there's an intergovernmental agreement that says that if you need services in the form of water and sewer, that you need to annex into Commerce City. And so from, I'm gonna call it a private landowner, urban infill kind of homeowner that wants to develop, they go to Commerce City and Commerce City says, we don't own it. You gotta go take off and talk to Adams County. You go to Adams County and Adams County says, hey, you need to go talk to Commerce City. So so it goes back and forth, and it's really related to the IGA that says if you need services. So is there anywhere in this document that we could send people to say, if you need water and sewer, because it's related to South Adams Water, because that's the next piece. Well, you need to go talk to South Adams Water. And people get so frustrated with that process. Is there a way to incorporate or at least have some language that basically outlines not the whole IGA, but says if you need water and sewer and these are your criteria, you need to annex into Commerce City? Because again, I've experienced it at least 5 times now in different properties that I've tried to develop, and the homeowner gave up because got to go talk to Adams County, got to go talk to Commerce City, got to go talk to South Adams Water, and they just keep going round and round, and nobody will ever reference the IGA. Is that in here?
We built, for his, as an example, we built a 45,000 square foot church out on Chambers. And it was a nightmare trying to get water so that, and the county wouldn't let us build until we annexed, and we couldn't annex until we had water. And it literally took us a half a year to get through that process. And so much of it is he said, she said, it's not identified, here's what you're going to have to do. Get busy.
So in a typical code, the closest, normally it comes to dealing with annexation is if a property were annexed, what the default zoning district would be for that property. And it can be either, there's different options for that. That's one thing, and I don't think you're really asking about that. And also we can have, just like with anything, if there's a mention of the IGA, there could be a link that would open up if a person clicked on it, would open up the actual text of the IGA into a new tab on their screen if they're using it digitally, that would have the text of the IGA. That's probably a complicated document that most people wouldn't understand, but they could do that as well. I don't know if potentially, as I mentioned, the platform that the code gets hosted in might potentially have the ability to have some kind of tool on it that would let a person, I'm kind of brainstorming on it, and I guess Brett is still on, I don't know if he's still on the line, but Brett, as overseeing Kennekeys Collaborative, also, we have a sort of subsidiary firm in Code Plus that is the drafting platform we use and the hosting that had the cool user-friendly features on it. Oh, he did. Okay. Well, shoot. I could imagine the potential to have like some kind of decision tree or check the box of where your property is located, that it might be able to then give you an answer about who you need to see in terms of different utilities or, water and land use or subdividing. That might be, and that's not part of the actual code, but it is part of the overall kind of package of the code and trying to have it be as user-friendly as possible. So Marcia's probably making notes about that, and we can ask Brett if that's something that Encode Plus can do. So that's kind of where I'm at for that right now.
Yeah, I'm not asking you to solve it. I'm just
Yeah.
flagging that you did reference that you met with South Adams Water. I don't know if you've touched base with the county on this particular topic. I know this is not Adams County authority having jurisdiction as Commerce City, but that happens a heck of a lot, and it would save staff time a lot rather than someone coming up to the front counter and going, hey, I want to do an urban infill, kind of project, and then all of a sudden, oh, you need to go talk to Adams County, and it's frustrating.
Well, another one, in addition to that, is is it the Highline Canal? What's the canal that goes through?
O'Brien.
O'Brien Canal. They are very difficult to work with, and that affects, we had to do a considerable amount of land, building up and putting down. Drainage problem was an issue there. And again, we didn't know about that until we were already in the problem. And somebody said, well, you have to have permission from this guy before we can go forward. And all of a sudden, we had new issues on the church. In addition to that, the South Platte and the series of ponds that go down it have a lot of distinctions about what you can and can't do in the areas around that. And that certainly needs to be addressed and isn't in our present code very well.
Right. And I think the development guidebook could be a place where some of the decision tree type thing that I was kind of brainstorming about could be a part of the development guidebook. Because that's, like I said, an online document. The thing is, the question is, how does someone, especially if they don't really know what they're doing, if they're not a development professional, how do they know what they don't know? And so for some codes we've done, we've had, it's hard to describe with words, but kind of a big menu, like if a person clicks on a thing that's obvious, like, it doesn't say click here, but basically click here, then a lot of topics will come up, like how do I subdivide a piece of property? How do I rezone a property? So, and they click that and it takes them to either the development guidebook section or the code section that shows the rezoning process. So I think that could be part of it, like having a menu of questions that clicking would take them to the right spot.
And then just another one of the fun entities just to identify, flag and all of that on the northern end would be FAA. Just FAA requirements in that as well.
Yeah, ditch companies, I had never heard of that term till I worked in Colorado, and I just assumed it was like some company that dug ditches or something, but now I know, that it's different than that, that just that terminology is very unique and someone coming here that has never, done a project here might not know at all what that is or have the wrong idea. So.
I would just add that a number of these issues are now, maybe not previously, but are now addressed through our pre-app process. And so anyone that wants to do anything in the city, including annex, right, they have a pre-app with us, which includes chatting with planning and engineering, sometimes economic development, right, where we really talk about a lot of these things, right? We can let them know, oh, there's a FRICO issue. I agree, it's challenging, right? Letting them know how the annexation process works, talking about water, right, all of those things. So a lot of those things are now addressed through pre-apps. They're also addressed through our Facts to Know, right, which is kind of what Brian's talking about on a more electronic platform, but sheets that kind of talk with people about, in layman's terms, right, what you need to do, what you need to be aware of. So a lot of those things do exist. They're not necessarily going to be new code items, right? Because they're working with all these other entities. So a lot of those, I would say, are in place. We agree some of them need to be easier, and so we'll keep working with not only these folks, but also, right, our internal processes and working with those partners to keep making that better and easier. But I would say the pre-app process is going to be the number one way that we would address most of those right now.
Yes, and I like Brian's suggestion where maybe there's just a question that says, when do I need to annex into Commerce City from Adams County? Very straightforward, when you need water services or when you need services, basically. I think, we can address it in the pre-app, but before people even get to the pre-app, we could probably solve a lot of the headache of the runaround. So finally someone gives up and they go, well, we could have a pre-app with you. And I'm not sure that our front window at the planning department is very straightforward on the very front end where they send people through the gauntlet a few times. So I would think maybe just having that kind of like, when do I need to annex that kind of thing. So a leading question with the answer to it. So thank you.
Sure.
Yeah.
I just another unrelated thought, just as it got brought up earlier in the conversation, related to the preponderances of PUDs, especially on the north end, just the reconciliation of nonconformance to potential nonconformance because of zoning that might have been adopted through that PUD. Just what might that process look like? Because in looking at these new zoning districts, just there may be gaps in them, just between the PUD and the zoning districts.
Well, the PUDs would typically stay in place,
But this would be related to development 10, 15, many years from now to something that would be non-conforming. Just how
within a PUD.
within a PUD, because there's some very large, expansive PUDs, and within that, just to understand what that process might be.
Well, I think if a PUD were in place when this code is adopted, that the PUD would remain in place and would have its rules would still be there. I don't know if the adoption of the LDC would it wouldn't change the rules within the PUD, at least not intentionally.
Sure. I was just thinking if there was any can of worms that might be open with future development, to align to potential development in the future. Just because of how there's a hodgepodge of things that people are trying to use with mechanisms that weren't in place, and you're trying to fix those now, where the code would. I'm trying to think how to frame my question.
This isn't just to talk about normal nonconformities outside of a PUD, if that helps at all. We try to, unless the city has a stated goal of certain things becoming nonconforming uses or nonconforming structures or lots, and I think Brett sort of got into this a little bit. Try to generally not have that a too negative of an impact and create a lot of nonconformities outside of a PUD. And if we do, we sometimes build in the ability for what we call minor and major nonconformities, where we set up criteria, of course, for what constitutes a minor versus a major. But a minor could go through a process like a conditional use permit. Basically, we've done it before, where what we would think of as a minor nonconformity. Maybe it's just something that about the building that doesn't conform to the setbacks any longer, or anyway, a process to allow them to become conforming, and so it helps with financing and with insurance, possibly just for the property owner, and that's more of often we do it as a conditional use process. We don't have to prove a hardship like you do with a variance, but just it's a way for the city to kind of wave a wand and say, okay, this property is now considered conforming, even though it's kind of not really, for purposes, again, of getting insurance and financing or whatever. But I'm struggling a little still with nonconformity within a PUD. If that PUD still is in place after this code is adopted, you know, the adoption of the code wouldn't create a nonconformity in that PUD because the PUD is still there and still running. Some,
I'll come back to you. Thank you.
and if anyone thinks of other things, if you, questions or comments, concerns, send them to staff and they'll get to us and we can provide a response back, of course.
Well, let me look and see if my commissioners have any other questions. Seeing none, I do want to thank you and your company. Sorry forgive me, I didn't catch the whole name and I don't want to slaughter it. So for the presentation and the outline of what next steps are in the conversation. So with that being said, I don't see anyone else as a commissioner for comment. Thank you. Do we have any other staff business? No. All right, and I know we can't really do anything, so thank you for the presentation. Meeting adjourned.